Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 4th of June. I intended to release a video yesterday, but due to audio issues, I couldn't. And I'm actually grateful for that because today we have some very important developments that play a big role in shaping the broader narratives surrounding certain sectors on the front line, especially around Novomykhailivka, now looking at Kostyantynivka. And so we're definitely going to put an emphasis on that today. We'll also look at Robotyne, the Vovchansk riverfront, and we'll finish off by looking at key events around Vovchansk and generally the Russian-Ukrainian border. Let's quickly go through what occurred in Robotyne because it's not a significant advance as of yet. We have this geolocated footage from June 1st showing a drone from the 118th Mechanized Brigade hitting a singular Russian soldier that was hiding near a Ukrainian, I believe, abandoned T-72, which was abandoned during the summer counteroffensive, which actually started a year ago today, if you're keeping track, June 4th, 2023. And just as a tidbit about the 118th Brigade, it has been present not for the full year, but it was incorporated to the battles on the Heorhiivka sector sometime during the summer. And during that time period, it did have on and off operations on the front line. So it wasn't always engaged in the combat activities because, of course, sometimes it was replaced and was given time to recuperate due to the presence of other units like the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, 47th Mechanized Brigade. Those are the three main ones that were active on the Heorhiivka sector for a very long time. And now you notice none of them are here anymore. So the 118th has been forced out of necessity to take up a lot of these frontline roles. And the only unit, I would say, besides the National Guard units that's doing more in the sector is the 65th Mechanized Brigade, which has been defending the Robotyne outskirts since the Russians captured the entirety of the village. In terms of the importance of the capture of this sliver of territory, which I guess it's like a 1 kilometer advance eastwards, it means the Russian forces are continuing to advance along a local hill that is located just to the east of Robotyne. They're trying to get a foothold in some of the dugouts that were either created by the Russians or Ukrainians during the summer and fall that are located in these forested regions. And that is an effort to just one by one undermine the various defensive nodes that the Ukrainians are occupying in the region in order to fully clear out these fields. You're seeing how this lid is basically being closed upon the salient that is formed in the area to the east of Robotyne and to the west of Robove over here. And the Russian forces, they are taking their time with this because they don't have a particular emphasis on clearing this out in comparison to other parts of the front line. But it is certainly something the Russians will want to do in the long term to essentially clear out the Ukrainian positions in this particular valley, which is getting more and more dangerous for Ukrainians to hold on to because now their positions are being undermined from this axis. They're being overlooked from the Verbove axis. And by extension, any sort of positions further north along this particular highway leading into Novomykhailivka or any suburbs or even the city of Heorhiivka are in more and more danger because the Russians are solidifying control closer to those areas and also do have the elevation advantage. And I will look at that in more detail in separate videos, but I do want to focus especially on the elevation in the Donetsk axis because that's where we have the most advances. Okay, so let's move on to the Kostyantynivka front as I referred to it. In my last video, I discussed the Russian unfolding of events in the sense that the Russians were able to, over the period of several weeks, to advance gradually through the gray zone in the areas just south of Kostyantynivka and clear one by one out several trenches and tree lines with the hope of eventually solidifying control over this southern flank that I'm marking in this red rectangle, with the hopes of then again entering Kostyantynivka, firing upon it, firing upon the chain of villages that connect to it. We're going to look at the elevation maps to get a better idea of that. In terms of frontline gains recently, we have this new video which shows 2 Russian tanks that were able to advance. If we measure it using the measuring stick here, it's an advance that amounts to 1.7 kilometers westwards. The two Russian tanks, they were hit and destroyed by Ukrainian Javelin crews, which prevented them from dismounting forces even further westwards in this one tree line over here, because that's where we're seeing In some cases, it's tanks that just have a lot of armor on them, whether it just be cope cages on top or turtle tanks in their entirety, some sort of slat armor, and they are carrying a large amount of forces either inside of them or on top, protected by the cope cages. And then they're dismounting in each vehicle individual infantry squads that then are able to quickly get out and engage with the Ukrainian forces if they're even located on the line of contact in various tree lines. And then, of course, you have assistance from other vehicles like MTLBs. But in terms of the amount of vehicles used in this red line in these fields, it's actually a rather small amount for each assault. The Russian forces instead are trying to concentrate as many infantrymen into a singular car, or not car, vehicle, armored vehicle or tank, and then dismount them quickly and then to get out of the front line. We do see larger tank columns and larger armored vehicle columns in the Novomykhailivka, Pobieda area, which we'll get to in a second. Just looking further north, the Russian forces were also able to secure control over a large amount of these fields, and we could just show you guys by highlighting this over here, the extent of the Russian advances in a nutshell. You can see it over here essentially. This was basically verified based on new footage that came out from the Russian side, or actually the Ukrainian side, from the 79th Air Assault Brigade, a Ukrainian unit that, again, we know it's been defending here for a while. It shows the various ways in which they were able to target the Russian column and inflict a pretty high amount of vehicular losses to the Russian side. So, of course, there's a lot of mines in the region, which is to be expected when you have just these huge swaths of open fields. So you have minefields, of course, that are causing damage to the lead tanks, artillery, ATGMs, drones especially being utilized, and then drones dropping grenades onto the Russian soldiers that disperse and try to hide in nearby tree lines. And so that's just the full compilation here. And in the overhead view by the units which recorded this video, which also includes engagements that occurred on the paved road that goes horizontally from Novomykhailivka into Pobieda. In total, there were new losses counted that amounted to 1 BMP-2 being destroyed, 2 armored fighting vehicles, 2 BTR-82As, and 2 tanks. And that's in addition to various other vehicles that had already been lost in previous engagements that were shown in the compilation by the 79th Brigade. Now, the 79th, they also showed this video over here, which shows, again, Ukrainian strikes on Russian vehicles and dismounted infantry in the Pobieda area. And honestly, I should adjust the map to indicate that these fields are generally under Russian control, indicating, again, at least a 1 kilometer advance westwards, meaning the Russians are now present on this vertical road. But more importantly, the Russian forces were able to utilize this momentum to continue advancing through Pobieda. We know that as of late May, they were able to solidify themselves in the eastern part of the hamlet. And then there was, I guess, a week and a half of just ambiguity with back and forth fighting, Ukrainian strikes, using their air force sometimes, like using the GBU-39s, for instance. And for a while, there was a bit of a stalemate, but the Russian forces, following their introduction of new armored columns and new sustained pressure throughout early June, were able to advance past the gray zone and get control over the entirety of the village. This was again confirmed by a video on June 3rd showing one Russian tank, a third turtle tank, getting stuck while it was trying to cross over the stream that runs in western Pobieda. And that's important because that crossing itself was damaged, and so they set up a sort of makeshift pontoon so then you could continue utilizing the paved road and reach the 00532 highway that runs over here. A very important road in terms of Ukraine's frontline logistics as it connects Kostyantynivka to Vovchansk further south. And so that's the current state of the operations with the Russians in control of Pobieda. Now their intention is to solidify control and basically create a two-pronged attack, because they do have the head-on option by utilizing the 2 paved roads they have under their control, and then they also have the options from the open fields, which are riskier in certain regards, and that's why we may be seeing less vehicles involved in certain operations. And on the other hand, you have this video here from June 1st, I believe, which shows the Russian 39th Motor Rifle Brigade. Their FPVs are working in the region, and they destroyed a Ukrainian tank south of Kostyantynivka, essentially giving us an idea of where their forward position really is, which is manned by at least certain elements of these 2 air assault brigades, some territorial defense forces, and then, of course, we have drone units that are active in the region. Further north, you have support from the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, which I talked about before. And if we look at the Russian side, I already said 39th Brigade, they're active here. You have 155th Marine Brigade fought really hard in Novomykhailivka. You go a bit to the east, 57th Guards More Rifle Brigade moved from Klishivka to fight over here, so they've played a role. And there's various other DPR units that are also involved. Before we finish, we're going to look at Pobieda. This is its geolocation from, I think it is today, yeah. It shows the 33rd Brigade conducting various FPV strikes onto Russian tanks and soldiers 1 kilometer south of the hamlets, which gives us an idea of the new Russian forward line, as the Russian forces have expanded control through the gray zone in areas where simply it was untenable for the Ukrainians to hold on to positions, and are gradually occupying control of the fields there, which also means that the Russian forces will have control over the northern flank, overlooking the Kostyantynivka and various villages located to the west that you can see on the map right now. And again, the defense here is from the 33rd, which is moved in last year to provide reinforcements for the Ukrainian side. It's part of why their front line didn't collapse in this region in late December, when there was a lot of Russian momentum in the region. That's to move in reinforcements. And you could also see that reflected with the 31st Mechanized Brigade having some of its elements moved to this region. We look further north. There's a geolocation from June 3rd, which shows 4 damaged or abandoned Russian turtle tanks, which are T-62s. And they were given, of course, the turtle tank design. And this was due to FPV strikes south of Marinka, which again shows that the current demarcation line is essentially where I had it marked previously, along this vertical road, with the Ukrainians, most of their forward positions in the region being located several kilometers westwards, where there are some large trenches that the Ukrainians are using to try to maintain a stable front line and also connect that to the center of Heorhiivka. Okay, so here we have a view of the elevation. I quickly made a sketch of the front line in red, showing the Russian forward positions. What you see is, first of all, recently the Russian forces advanced several kilometers westwards from Solodka. This is really important because they were able to secure the entirety of the hill located in that particular region. Another effect of the Russian advances through various fields in recent weeks has been the capture of the entirety of this ridge that runs just to the northwest of the railway that you see marked over here, and northwest of Solodka in Stepnya. And this also gives the Russians control of several higher elevated areas. You can see that Novomykhailivka and the surrounding regions are on low-lying valleys, very similar in elevation to Kostyantynivka, for instance. But the advantage the Russians have is, for instance, looking further east, they do have positions on a ridge in Slavnya. And then they were able to capture additional heights, not really anything massive, but still in terms of relative elevation, still on a higher ground than the Ukrainian positions located along these parallel lines that are marking over here, these dotted lines. If you look at the Ukrainian side, and you can't see it fully, so I will delete this, and hopefully you guys still understand what I'm referring to. I'm going to move a little bit to the west. You guys can see that all of these Ukrainian positions, whether it be Kostyantynivka, the T-05424 highway leading southwest into Vuhledar over here in green, or any other villages that are connected to it along this particular river, I believe it is, all of them are on very low depressions, and there are a few ridges in between, or at least hills, which are in between some of these lower valley regions. You could see that over here, for instance, marked, and you could see it marked over here. And some of these have been in the process of getting captured by the Russians, and other ones simply aren't that relevant to the front line because they are farther away from population centers, farther away from the front line, for instance. Perhaps not as many defenses built in the region. But in any case, the Ukrainians themselves, they are in a difficult position here because the Russian forces have secured all of these various hills that are overlooking it, both from the north, which we'll get to in a second, but especially from the east and from the south in the past few weeks. And that will all be directed towards, first of all, securing the southern flank to physically attack Kostyantynivka, but also just utilizing shorter range firepower, whether it be ATGMs or any sort of mortars, anything of the sorts. Those will all be utilized to fire upon the Ukrainian garrison in the village and further westward supply lines. We go further north for a second to get an idea that even on the northern flank, the Russian forces have an advantage. And this is a part of why they went for Pobieda in the first place a couple of months ago. They got control over this section of the highway. They were able to advance south and hop from trench to trench. They fought a very fierce battle for the Pobieda outskirts and defeated the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. And then from there, they were able to solidify control over nearby hills. You see just south of Marinka in this area that I'm dotting in red. It's just all a hill that is essentially overlooking and has very good line of sight towards the chain of villages located to the southwest. And so that's all part of the Russian planning that was really thought out through several months of advances, and it's the way that it just ended up getting shaped. And it is a very difficult predicament for the Ukrainian side in this village. And something that I really should have mentioned is that certain elements of the 59th Motorized Brigade were actually moved from the Novomykhailivka area, which is just to the southwest of Avdiivka, in order to assist in the defending of villages west of Novomykhailivka. And this happened a couple of weeks ago. And additionally, the Ukrainians in the sector received support from the 123 Con Regiment, which has a strong drone component. And that's going to factor into what we talk about today in the region around Nevelsky and Netalove. So here you can see this geolocated video from June 3rd showing the Ukrainian forces dropping grenades onto garden plots where you had Russian infantry located in the eastern section of the village of Karlivka, which indicated over a 1 kilometer advance westward for the Russian side. You can see that over here on the map. And this is very important because Netalove has turned into a significant city for the Russians, as they're using it as a forward operating base to conduct attacks, whether it be westwards, northwards, or southwards. Westwards, you can see how it's developing along the highway and has played a role in securing these houses. And then from there, there is direct access to the road as it crosses over the Vovchansk River towards the Ukrainian line of defense that was built as a fallback line, which is centered around various ridges located west of the river, various trenches that are connected together at this very point in time, and various populated areas. And so it is important for the Russians to begin undermining that as soon as possible. And then you look at how the Russians are pretty close to this filtration plant over here. You also look at how the Russian forces have utilized Netalove in order to advance several kilometers, or you could say 1.5 kilometers southwards, and clear out various dachas, forested regions, and dugouts that the Ukrainians set up in order to protract the amount of fighting east of the Vovchansk River. And so now Netalove is being used as a springboard to attack those positions. And you could see how the front line has really shaped up in recent days as a result along this dotted line, where the dividing line between the Russians and Ukrainians is essentially this lower lying parts of the front line where you have two adjacent tree lines that are running for a span of several kilometers. And then from there, the final ridge that the Ukrainians have under their control in this region is located over here and sort of runs through northern Nevelsky. And so now Netalove is also going to be used to attack those positions. When you look at Karlivka again, and just a bit to the north, the Russian forces strengthening their positions over here and actively targeting Ukrainian vehicles, utilizing the Sparta Battalion, which is, I think, has been renamed the 80th Battalion, but that's how it's colloquially referred to. And so they released a compilation recently showing their FPVs targeting Ukrainian vehicles. Here's just some examples. Here's a Ukrainian tank hit by Sparta. There's a few other videos over here that are more recent. For instance, one from Yazdobrodivka. It shows a compilation of targeting of the 25th Airborne Brigade, a Ukrainian unit that's also here that has been involved in the defense, hitting their APCs, tanks, and just generally the houses in the region. Further west, we're seeing the consequences of the very narrow pass through which you have to go through to go in and out of the front line, because you could see there's a very narrow corridor to cross through the Karlivka reservoir over here, and a lot of vehicles are being targeted right now by drones, but maybe later on they'll be targeted by artillery as the front line gets closer and closer to that region. And so you could see ammo just that it got cooked off in Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle. It got destroyed by the FPV drone. That occurred today. We go further north, and there's additional Russian advances that occurred in the regions, basically to the northwest of Robotyne. This is based on reporting from Deep State. And you could see that basically the Russians advanced 100 to 200 meters westwards, were able to infiltrate into the first houses in Novomykhailivka, despite the fact that a large amount of reinforcements were sent here to prevent any sort of exploitation. And that's really the big reason why the Russians were unable to continue capitalizing on their gains throughout the past month. Of course, they also took an operational pause, but these reinforcements were significant in that regard. Now the Russian forces are beginning to create some holes in that defense line, and they were also able to slightly broaden the front line in this area just to the east of Novomykhailivka, and the gray zone has expanded with the Ukrainians withdrawing from some positions on this local ridge, trying to perhaps coalesce control further north along a more stable line that is directly to the west of Kalinove. And yeah, so I should also mention that there's heavy fighting going on east of Sokil. I know there's some information regarding the entrance of Russian forces into the village, but so far I don't have confirmation of that. But we do know that there has been clashes with the Ukrainians, especially relying on Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, especially due to their 25mm autocannons firing towards the Russian-controlled trenches and firing towards accumulations of soldiers and vehicles that try to advance from Solovyove along the paved road into Sokil or into the trenches directly. And so the Bradleys have played a big role in holding the line in these past few weeks. But that, of course, comes at a cost. We know about the Abrams tank that was hit near Sokil by the FPV drone. Here's a video of the 14th Artillery Brigade. It's a DPR unit. I think it's called Kalmus. And so they're shelling Ukrainian Bradley and Sokil. And I don't know if it got destroyed, but at the end of the video, the vehicle stopped moving. Over here, we have a video which shows the 110th Mechanized Brigade, which is still active on this sector after really months of fighting in a period of time where it was rotated out. They hit a Russian BTR-82. And so, yeah, you're seeing the increase in vehicular losses by the Russian side as they're inching closer and closer to Sokil. That's what happens when you organize a large number of forces and vehicles along a singular path with the intention of pushing through. And now we're just going to have to see how that develops, whether the Russians are able to eventually succeed and then break through Sokil and overrun the defenses that were set up by the 47th Mechanized Brigade in the region. Meanwhile, looking at Vovchansk, there's not a whole lot of changes, but today I did see Russian sources beginning to admit that the Ukrainians were successful in their counterattacks, which occurred now a week and a half ago. And so a lot of mappers, they adjusted their front line to show that there is general Ukrainian control in these blocks over here generally. The thing is, even that's an understatement. The Ukrainians do have a significant presence throughout the northern section of Vovchansk, and recently they've also continued expanding it, including over the past couple of days where we've seen them present in the cemetery area. There's heavy fighting going on in the high-rise apartment buildings and in nearby enterprises like the mall over here. And then they also control some of these less dense areas in these private residential buildings that have not been taken over by the Russian side. And so this was again confirmed by a video, I think it's from yesterday. It shows a Russian soldier surrendering to the 36th Marine Brigade. Remember, this brigade was moved in from Kherson to operate in Vovchansk, at the very least only a 2nd Battalion, but perhaps maybe other elements. And it also raises the question about whether other Marine brigades that are not in Krinky could also be moved to this part of the front instead of wasting time in a more irrelevant theater. And so the Russian soldier surrendering here on his own, it basically indicates that it's in the gray zone and that the Ukrainians are nearby. And so that's just the rationale for my mapping of the situation. Also, there's no truth in the claim that the Russian forces are in or are in control of the aggregate facility located here. The Ukrainians are still in control of it, with the Russian forces located near this highway nearby. And that's been the case now for about a week, where we're just seeing heavy fighting due to the Russians being able to exploit their initial advances and attack along this highway and along these large buildings and apartments, and basically get a foothold in the southernmost section of northern Vovchansk. And so that's going to be a critical role, this section, in eventually clearing out the remaining Ukrainian positions that are further in the eastern parts of northern Vovchansk. And so the reason why the Ukrainians succeeded in counterattacking is because they did move in a large number of forces to this region, especially from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, but we're also going to cover some other units like 36th Brigade I just mentioned. And of course, they're moving in all of their weaponry as well and drone support. So a lot of these units were moved in and assisted in the counterattack. And the counterattack itself is very important because it gives the Ukrainians time to build up additional forces, build new defenses, set up firing points throughout the southern part of Vovchansk, because eventually the Russian forces will be successful at clearing out the northern bank. And so at that point, the Ukrainians would prefer that all of the various districts in Vovchansk south of it would become more impenetrable than they were during the initial Russian advances, due to the reinforcements, due to the trenches, due to beefing up the artillery and air defenses in the region.